Hello and welcome. I am Shahid Hussain Somro, and today we are going to learn about the arrival of the East India Company in the Indian subcontinent. The 16th and the 17th century marked a pivotal moment in the history of Indian subcontinent as the arrival of the East India Company set the stage for a profound transformation in the region's political, economic and cultural landscape. The East India Company, a joint stock company founded by the English merchants, first established a presence in the India in the early 17th century, seeking to capitalize on lucrative spice trade and other valuable resources. This initial foothold would eventually lead to the country's gradual expansion and establishment of trading posts, settlements, eventually the consolidation of its political control over large swaths of Indian continent. The events surrounding the East India Company's arrival and its subsequent rise to power will be focus of this lecture, and we explore the complex web of political, economic and cultural factors that shape the region's history during this pivotal era. We will also explore the broader context of European colonialism in the Indian subcontinent, examining the arrival and expansion of other colonial powers, such as the Portuguese and the Dutch, and the fierce rivalries that emerged as they competed for control over trade and territories. The rise of European colonialism in the Indian subcontinent, building on the earlier exploration of the arrival of East India Company in region, and these slides explore into the broader context of European colonialism, the expansion in the Indian continent during the 16th and the 17th century. The Portuguese were among the earlier European powers to establish a presence in India, setting up the trading posts and settlements in the strategic locations like Goa, Diu, and Daman, which allowed them to gain control over the lucrative spice trades. Soon after, the East India Company, or VOC, also expanded its operations in India, establishing trading posts and solidifying its hold over the spice lands. Parallel to those developments, the British East India Company gradually extended its influence, establishing trading posts and ultimately gaining control over large parts of the Indian subcontinent. Fierce competition and conflicts arose between these European powers as they vied for the dominance over trade, resources, and territories in the region, shaping the political and economic landscape of the Indian subcontinent. This set the stage for the upcoming slide, which will explore the establishment and early expansion of the East India Company's presence in region. The establishment of the East India Company, building upon the growing European colonial presence in India. And these slides we will explore the founding and the early expansion of the East India Company, a key driver of the Britain's rising influence in the region. In 1600, the East India Company was granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I of England, empowering the company to establish trade and commerce with the East Indies. This marked the beginning of the company's engagement with Indian subcontinent. The company quickly established its first factory in Surat, Gujarat in 1612, solidifying its foothold in the region. Over the following decades, the company continued to expand its reach, acquiring strategic coastal towns like Madras in 1639 and Mumbai in 1661, which became important trading hubs and settlement sites. By 1690, the company had established a factory in Calcutta, which would later become the center of its operations and the capital of British India, underscoring the growing dominance of East India Company in the region. The establishment and expansion of the East India Company was driven by a combination of commercial and geopolitical motives, as the company sought to gain control over lucrative Indian markets and expand Britain's influence in the subcontinent. The East India Company's commercial and geopolitical motives, building on the previous slide, we have seen how the Indian companies established a strong foothold in the Indian subcontinent, starting with their first factory in Surat and later expanding to the key locations Madras and Calcutta. However, the company's motivation went beyond mere trade and commerce. As the historian William Dalrymple notes, the East India Company was driven by a combination of commercial and geopolitical ambitions. They sought not only to establish lucrative trading outposts, but also to expand their influence and control over the Indian markets. This dual pronged approach allowed the East India Company to gain strategic advantage as well, both economically and politically, in this region. By securing the posts and the forging relationship with local rulers, the company was able to solidify its presence and position itself as a dominant power in the Indian subcontinent. Looking ahead, we will explore how this expansion and the company's growing influence ultimately led to the establishment of the British Raj and the transformation of the Indian landscape under colonial rule. The expansion of the East India Company, as we have seen, the East India Company was driven by a combination of commercial and geopolitical motives, seeking to establish trading outposts and expand its influence in the lucrative Indian markets. This relentless pursuit of power and profit would lead to the company's gradual domination over the vast swaths of the Indian continent. The Battle of Plassey and the Diwani riots in 1757, the East India Company achieved a major milestone with its victory in the Battle of Plassey. This decisive military triumph established the company's political and military dominance in Bengal. Building on this success, the company was further granted the Diwani rights in 1765, giving them the authority to collect revenue and administer the provinces of the Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Defeating the Marathas confederacy, the company's expansion continued unabated as it turned its sights towards western and central India. In 1818, the East India Company decisively defeated the Marathas confederacy, allowing it to extend its control over these regions. The transition to crown rule, however, the company's unchecked expansion and the suppression of the Indian Rebellion in 1857 ultimately led to its downfall. The dissolution of the East India Company and the transfer of the power to the British Crown marked a significant shift in the governance of India, and as we will explore in the upcoming slides. The influence of the East India Company on the British colonial policies, building on the, as we have discussed in previous slides, the East India Company's territorial expansion, we now examine how this company's economic and political interest heavily influenced the decisions made by the British government regarding its colonial policies in India. The British government granted the East India Company a monopoly on the trade in India and provided military support to protect the company's commercial interests as well. In return, the company provided the government with revenue and resources from its colonial ventures and creating a mutually beneficial relationship. This dynamic enabled the East India Company to aggressively expand its control over the Indian territories, leading to the gradual annexation of the subcontinent by the British government. The company's military capabilities and the government's political and diplomatic support facilitated this process. Furthermore, the East India Company's administrative practices and the policies in India were often adopted and integrated into the government's colonial administration. This includes the establishment of legal system, taxation structures, and the development of infrastructure to support the company's commercial interests. The complex and intertwined relationship between the East India Company and the British government played a significant role in the expansion and the consolidation of the British rule in India, setting the stage for the next phase of this lecture, which will examine the economic impact of the company's presence in the subcontinent. The impact on the Indian companies, building on, as we had discussed in the previous slide, about the East India Company's influence on British colonial policies. In this slide, we will examine the significant economic consequences that the company's presence had on the Indian subcontinent. The company's monopolistic control over trade and extraction of the resources and implementation of the policies favoring British interest led to the deindustrialization of the India. The decline of the traditional industries and the country's transition from a self-sufficient economy to a supplier of raw materials and a market for both British manufactured goods. The East India Company's domination of the trade and its extraction of the resources from India disrupted the country's existing economic structures. Traditional industries such as textile and handicrafts, which had previously thrived, saw a sharp decline as they were unable to compete with the influx of the cheaper, mass-produced British goods. This process of deindustrialization had a profound impact on the Indian economy, transforming it from a self-sufficient, diversified system to one that was primarily geared towards the production and export of raw materials to support the British Industrial Revolution. In the upcoming slide, we will discuss the resistance of colonial rule as previous groups from soldiers or civilians to peasants and the tribal communities engaged in uprisings and movements to challenge the East India Company's control and demand self-governance for India. In this slide, we will explore the various forms of resistance and nationalist movement that challenged the colonial rule in subcontinent. The revolt, specifically the revolt of the 1857, as also known as the Indian Mutiny, this was a major uprising against the East India Company's rule, involving both soldiers, civilians across northern and central India. The revolt was a significant event that demonstrated the growing discontent among the Indian population with the company's exploitative practices and administrative policies. One of them, civil disobedience, led by the Mahatma Gandhi. This non-violent resistance campaign aimed to defy the British colonial government's authority and the demand self-rule for India. The government played a pivotal role in Indian independence struggle, inspiring the masses to participate in the civil disobedience and non-cooperation with the colonial regime. Peasant uprisings and the tribal resistance, as we discussed earlier, the various peasant-led rebellions such as the Indigo Revolt and the Deccan Riots protested against the exploitative land revenue policies, oppressive policies of the East India Company. Indigenous tribal groups like the Centers and the Bhils engaged in the armed struggles to defend their land, resources, and traditional way of life against the encroachment of the colonial rule. Nationalist movements emerged. Emerging national organizations like the Indian National Congress organized political campaigns, boycotts, and civil disobedience to challenge legitimacy of the East India Company's control over India. These movements, along with the East Congress, many other political parties, nationalist political parties like Muslim League at that time and the other Muslim religious political parties as well, along with the along with the Indian National Congress, protested against the brutal rule of India Company. These movements laid the foundation for the eventual independence of the countries from British rule. As we see transition, as we have seen, the resistance to the colonial rule took various forms, from armed uprisings to non-violent civil dissolutions, which all of which contributed to the growing nationalist sentiment and the eventual transition of the Indian from the East India Company's control to direct British rule, which we'll explore in the upcoming slide as well. As we have seen, as we have discussed earlier, that the consolidation of the British rule, building on the previous slide discussion, and resistance of the colonial rule. Now we are moving forward to the next phase of the India's history, saw the consolidation of the British dominance over the subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked the turning point as the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal, setting the stage for the company's increasing political and economic control. Similarly, the Regulating Act of 1773 further strengthened the British government's authority over the East India Company, laying the foundations for a more centralized colonial administration. The company, the Indian Rebellion of 1857 till 1858, also known as the First War of Independence, was a major uprising against the East India Company's rule. Though it was ultimately suppressed, the rule through the Government of Act 1858, this transition ushered the era of British Raj, with Queen Victoria's proclamation as the Empress of India in 1876, solidifying the British monarchy's control over the subcontinent. So this is all from my side, and if you have any question, any queries, any concerns regarding this lecture, please feel free to ask me. Our website is available for you, PakStudy.xyz, and you can also email us if you think that there if there comes any sort of problem in your learning or in your academic journey of your studies. So please feel free to ask any question in comment section, and as well you can log on our site website and just email us solutions at PakStudy.xyz. So thank you all of you.